Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and answering your questions tonight, Q&A's first ever panel of business leaders. The founder of Aussie Home Loans, John Symond, businesswoman and chair of the Women's Leadership Institute, Carol Schwartz, the head of Santos Oil and Gas, David Knox, Nestle Australia chair, Elizabeth Proust, and the chair of Infrastructure New South Wales and former president of the Business Council of Australia, Graham Bradley. Please welcome our panel. Thank you, and as usual, we're being simulcast on ABC News 24 and News Radio. You can join the Twitter conversation with the Quanda hashtag that just appeared on your screen. And our first question is from Nee Wallace-Brown.
Thank you, Tony. My question to the panel is this. In the lead-up to the recent federal election, it was mentioned that a coalition government would boost business confidence. Do you feel that this has occurred in reality? And if not, what is required to improve this?
Graham Bradley, let's start with you.
Well, I'd like to think that all Australians would like to see this government, new government, improve and strengthen Australia's economy. And I think the business community has high expectations and we're waiting to see what can happen. I think they've made a very good start with some reviews of very important issues such as the Commission of Audit to look at all government expenditure and see what we can do to get on top of structural deficit problems that we have right across the country, not only in federal government but also in state governments. And they've shown a lot of interest in consulting with the business community, which I think will be very well received and will lift the confidence of the business community and I think of all Australians.
Graham, the Treasurer, Joe Hockey, says that every cupboard he opens has spiders in it. He's already said the budget outlook is significantly worse, growing revenue hole in the future. What's there to be confident about?
We know we have problems, but we also have some very great underlying strengths in our economy. We've got some great natural advantages, and I think if we can harness the energy of our people and our business community, then we can grow this economy. That'll grow the revenues and that'll solve some of the Treasurer's problems.
Carol Schwartz. Sorry, Carol Schwartz. Yeah. I beg your pardon.
That's okay. Very interesting question, Nee, because the fact is that, as is always the case, you have certain businesses in certain parts of the economy doing well and certain businesses not doing so well. So, for example, if you talk to retailers, they will probably tell you that business isn't so great. But if you talk to John Symond, he'll probably tell you that business is pretty good at the moment, which means that the government is dealing with a whole range of issues amongst a whole different group of industries. I guess the thing that I'm thinking about in these terms is that decisions are going to have to be made by our government, and they're going to be decisions that affect business as well as the community generally. And the question I ask myself is whether a cabinet of 18 men and 1 woman can actually make the decisions, the right decisions for business, for the economy and for our nation generally.
Carol, did you think that's just not possible? I mean, being so out of balance in a gender sense?
Well, I do, Tony. In fact, all the research over the last few years has been showing that diverse groups of people make the best decisions. You can even have a homogenous group of people with really high IQs and they don't make as good decisions as those in a diverse group. So I am really concerned that we're not going to get the decisions and the outcomes that we deserve as a nation without a balanced cabinet.
We'll come back to that question later. Surely we've got people in the audience who want to ask more about that issue. Let's go to John Symond now. Back to the question, has business confidence grown since a change of government?
Well, business confidence has grown in anticipation, but, you know, true leadership's all about action. The government needs billions of dollars to be able to do the right thing, to get this country going, to invest in infrastructure. And the billions that's ripped up in unnecessary red tape, government, you know, if they want to find tens of billions of dollars a year, cut down the bureaucracy. Why do we need 8 health systems? Why do we need upper and lower house in the States? Why do we need 560 councils around the country? It's costing tens of billions. It creates red tape. Bureaucracy is strangling our system, and yet here's an opportunity. It's not going to be easy and it's not going to be popular by a lot of public servants, but here's an opportunity to get tens of billions of dollars a year, increase productivity and increase efficiency.
Now, Joe Hockey can only really touch the federal public service. He's obviously got a commission of audit looking at federal government spending. Are you talking about changing the federation?
Well, if it needs to go there, at the end of the day, it's no good, Tony, shifting the deck chairs on a Titanic. Where's the money going to come from? You know, you can't just keep slugging low-income earners. You've got to incentivise business to grow their business so they can create employment. They've got to get rid of inefficient taxes. The tax system's got to be overhauled. Fancy taxing companies by creating employment. It's the most immoral tax. You employ, we need employment. You employ, we're going to tax you. It's ridiculous.
Elizabeth Proust, business confidence. Has it grown since the new government? That's really the question.
I agree with the panel. I think it's very patchy. There's some signs that business confidence is there in parts, but I think the new government is finding that there's a big difference between being in opposition and being in government. And we'll probably be better able to answer that question after the first couple of weeks.
From your point
Parliament.
of view, what would create more confidence?
I think some of it is addressing the issues that they've already addressed. So some of the tax changes announced by the Treasurer last week are welcome, but I think there's a big conversation to be had in addition to how we're governed, and that is we're a small population, 23 million people in a very large country, and in one form or another, we're going to have to pay for the infrastructure that's needed for the future. And we need to have an adult conversation about how we're going to pay for that.
Well, I mean, here's interesting. You mentioned the tax changes last week, but of course, Joe Hockey gave up $3 billion of revenue with those changes.
Making the deficit larger.
Exactly. So how's he going to reverse that? What would you advise?
Well, there's a bit of waiting for the Commission of Audit that Graham has mentioned, but we've got a history, both sides of government, of commissioning these bodies and then doing nothing or very little with it. In fact, most of what I think we need to do is already there as recommendations from the past. So there's plenty of ideas, plenty of good ideas that have gone into these commissions. It's just a matter now of making some decisions and getting on with it.
David Knox, the question to you again was about business confidence.
Yeah, well, here we are with the new government. We're in a great part of the world, in Asia. If you look at, obviously, one of our biggest trading partners, China, it's growing at 7% per year. That means that the economy of China is doubling every 10 years, which is completely extraordinary. And here we are placed in good proximity to that economy. So I think we should absolutely have every confidence as we go forward. And I would say that, as John says, we need to get great leadership. We need to get some rubber on the road, and we need to get it fairly early. And I would strongly suggest that we don't wait for the Commission of Audit to complete its work. We don't wait for everyone just to discuss and to continually recycle ideas. I think we've got to get some rubber on the road. And I suggest the first thing we should look at is regulation. We have a system of regulations in this country that, to say the least, is extremely complicated, and it overlaps. It overlaps between state and the Commonwealth. And I think the first task of government is to just simplify that, please. Remove the overlapping regulations. If they did that, that would lift a huge weight off businesses' shoulders. I'll just give you one example that occurred in my own company. We had to submit a project environmental statement to the Queensland government, which we did. It weighed 65 kilograms. It's absolutely ludicrous. It was 60,000 pages long. It was completely comprehensive. We then, subsequent to getting approval of that, we then effectively submitted exactly the same document to the Commonwealth government. And they went through another process. Now, why on earth can't we obviously have them so that they overlap, that we do it once and we do it well? And I think this is important because it's not just firms like my own. We have the resources to do this, but imagine if you're a smaller firm. Imagine if you're a small firm having to put a document of that size, that level of detail on the table. I'd say it's impossible. So no wonder that we are struggling a bit. And yet, I think the opportunity is absolutely fantastic for us to break out, and we should grasp it with this new government.
Well, David, there are some people who've got questions about coal seam gas, and they probably think there should be more regulations on you. We'll come to some of those later. Let's start with a question from Les Gallagher.
Thanks, Tony. I'd like to ask if any of the business people on the panel supports the carbon tax?
Carol Schwartz.
I think that when you think back to 2007, 2008, there was an absolute consensus in this country about the need to deal with carbon emissions. The fact is that Australia is the second largest polluter per capita globally of carbon. And I don't think that any of us are very proud of that. And I think that the carbon tax, although was meant to be the first stage of the emission trading scheme. And Julia Gillard herself has said that by calling it a carbon tax, she actually created a big problem for herself, a political problem. So all of a sudden, the consensus that had been gained was actually lost, and it became a political football. I actually think that had she said, this is the first stage of the carbon trading scheme, and we are then moving into the global market for carbon, I think that it would have been much more successful, and I think that we as a nation would have been very happy to accept that.
John Symond, let's hear you on that. I mean, the carbon tax, of course, was named that by Julia Gillard when asked a question about it. Do you think the carbon tax or a carbon price still a good idea?
No, I think there needs to be a price on carbon, but I think the way it was structured as a carbon tax was the wrong way to go. And I still firmly believe that is the wrong way to go, but there needs to be a price on carbon.
Yeah.
Graham Bradley, there needs to be a price on carbon?
Well, I'm not quite so convinced that what we put in place here was a good idea and the way it was implemented. We had one of the highest taxes on carbon of any country in the world, much higher than Europeans, much higher than any other countries put in place, and that's been a huge impost on Australian industry. It's lost us jobs. It's sent overseas jobs. It's closed smelters. It's had quite an impact on the Australian economy, and that's why I think there's been a popular mandate for the repeal of that tax. It was too far too soon without the backing of an international agreement.
The Australian Industry Group says that we shouldn't expect prices to drop once the carbon tax is axed, if indeed it is axed, because most businesses did not pass on the cost of the carbon tax. Is that true in your experience?
Look, there's a lot of factors that go to make electricity prices go up, as they have, significantly for most Australians, households and businesses over recent times. For example, carbon tax is just one of them. There's also the price of gas. There's also the cost of linking renewable energy and wind farms into our system, and the capital costs associated with that. So it'd be wrong to expect a sudden and dramatic reduction in all costs across the economy by abolishing just one of the factors that's affected that.
Elizabeth.
It was a broken promise, and it looked and felt like a broken promise. The price was too high. But I don't know anybody who doesn't believe that climate change is real, and we do need to deal with our emissions. The problem, I think, as Carol's pointed out, the consensus about it broke down early, so that it became a divisive issue both in the community and between the political parties, and getting back to some kind of consensus is now going to be hard.
Do you agree with both Carol and John? There still should be a carbon price.
There should be a carbon price and an emission trading scheme, and I don't think there's many people in business who would disagree with that.
The coalition is going to find that surprising, because their basic argument is we'll get rid of the carbon tax and business confidence will go back up again.
Well, I think that's again another difference between being in opposition and being in government. It's easy in opposition to have stop the boats, end the carbon tax, but when you get into government, you actually have to do something about the fundamental causes of those issues.
Do you think business is actually saying this to government at the highest levels? Because we now have a coalition government. It's absolutely set on having no carbon tax, no carbon price, no emissions trading scheme, and yet we hear a kind of consensus on this table that there should be a carbon price and an emissions trading scheme.
Tony, can I just say one thing? I want to agree with Elizabeth, and I was at a number of international conferences, 5-7 years ago, where each CEO of a multinational company was saying they were already putting a price on carbon. That's the way that they were costing their businesses. they were putting a price on carbon, and I believe that a number of the Australian businesses do as well.
Let's go to David.
Yeah, as Carol says, we have been assuming and modelling in our economics the price of carbon for a very long time. The key issue here is we need to have ultimately a global price on carbon in order to really make this scheme work. Global crisis. But in the meantime, the government's chosen to go to direct action policy. That's clearly their choice, and we as business will support them in moving to that. But the fundamental thing here is we want to achieve two things. We want Australia to remain competitive. That's extremely important, and we want to drive down our carbon footprint. So we want to achieve those dual things. And through direct action, that can be done, provided we get it right. So we now need to engage with government to get that right. The second thing we need to think about is we need to think in the longer term. Now, how are we going to get our emissions down in the Australian economy so they go down and they stay down? And you've really got a few levers. You haven't got very many. I would say you've got 3 levers to pull, and you've got to decide through science and through discussion how are you going to do them. That's how much coal do you burn in the economy, how much gas do you burn in the economy, and how much renewables do you want. Those are your 3 levers. And it's important that you think about that very hard. Now, the key thing here is I think everybody in this room understands if we can get our emissions down, right now we produce about 0.9 tonnes of carbon for every megawatt hour. I would challenge that we could get the emissions in Australia down by, say, half of that if we really went for it, if we pulled those levers in the correct way by mixing renewables, mixing gas, and then basically keeping the coal to a bare minimum in order to provide some base load. We can do it. And that, I think, is the real challenge that we need to set ourselves going forward over the next 5 to 10 years.
David, one of the fundamental reasons for a carbon price, carbon tax, was to actually make it competitive for gas-fired power stations to work compared to coal-fired power stations. In other words, to price in the pollution from a coal-fired power station, gas being quite a bit cleaner. So can you make that work in another way with a direct action policy?
Yes, I believe, obviously the government hasn't rolled out the actual details of the direct action policy, but yes, clearly they could. They could do that by really fundamentally reducing the amount of brown coal that's burned in our economy. That's why our emissions are quite high. They're at, as I say, about 0.9 tonnes per megawatt hour. The state I live in South Australia, where we have far less coal in the mix, and we have a lot of renewables. We have 25% renewables in South Australia, and we combine it with the gas. Those emissions are down to 0.6 tonnes per megawatt hour. So it's absolutely feasible to bring emissions down by playing with the levers, adjusting the mix. And frankly, South Australia's done it and done it very effectively.
But you can only do that by taxing the polluters, can't you? Or by penalising the polluters?
No, you don't need to. You need to make choices, and they need to be based on science. And you need to use, obviously, the taxation system wisely. But you need to do it in such a way that you get the outcome you want, which is lower carbon footprint, and yet we want this economy to stay fully competitive.
OK, I'm just going to... Graham wants to get involved. I just want to go quickly to that question on the floor. Go ahead.
Lower carbon footprint. On that, what is the real tangible difference in the former government's scheme or the current government scheme to the environment? I put it to 0.
OK, we'll take that as a comment. Let's hear from Graham Bradley.
Yeah, I was going to make the point, Tony, that the country in the world that's made the greatest reduction in its carbon emissions is the United States. And it didn't sign up to Kyoto, and it hasn't put a tax on carbon. And it's done it by a regulation of the emissions of vehicles, which is a direct action sort of technique. And it's also brought on stream a great abundance of coal seam and shale gas, which has allowed it to substitute for higher emission technologies for electricity. So there's a country that's used technology and science and its natural resources to, in fact, address this problem without a carbon tax or a price on emissions.
OK, let's move on. We've got a few questions to get through. Our next one is from Peter Rage.
Thanks, Tony. Could the panel give us their thoughts on the tax hike large businesses will pay to fund Tony Abbott's parental leave scheme for his so-called women of calibre?
John Symond.
Good question. I'm against doing that. I think it's discriminatory, and you know, I don't think that, you know, it's fair across the board. It's you know, again, it's clutching at straws to grab money. I think it was probably a good vote winner, trying to win over women, but I'm certainly not for that. However, you have a look at a lot of companies, ours included, you know, we give what I think is generous parental leave. We'll give 6 weeks up front. When they come back, we pay another 6 weeks. We'll give time off for parental leave as well. I think a lot of companies are sensitive to making sure that their employees look forward to coming and working at that company. To do that, you've got to be fair. But I just think that this one, there's an imbalance. It may well be that you need to cap a certain level for the higher income earners, and that would be fairer. But we do need some parental system, but it's got to be balanced and fair. But I think that one, is just too expensive. In the end of the day, another tax impost that, causes the wrong behaviour and forces the wrong behaviour by employers saying, well, look, we can't afford to hire women. And I mean, we don't want that.
John, the government's looking at a huge revenue hole. So obviously a lot of this is being paid for by business. It'll also obviously then be passed on to consumers. But it's also, some of it is public money. Are you saying they should delay it?
Well, if the economy was going gangbusters and we were employing and, the economy is a much more healthy state, you can afford to take chances and do things like this. But right now, we're going through a tough time. I mean, talk to retailers. How are they going to fund that? I just think the timing's wrong. They can delay it, but I think that they can massage it to be much fairer and put a cap on the higher income earners.
Carol.
Thanks for your question, Peter. Aren't all Australian women of calibre? I think that...
Some are larger calibre than others.
Sure, I agree.
Higher paid than others.
That's dangerous territory.
I think that paid parental leave in this country is almost a given. I think John's absolutely right. I mean, it's available. A lot of companies pay it, and they pay it very fairly and very willingly because they appreciate the parents who work within their business, and they want to make sure that they're properly looked after. The big issue for us in this country is actually childcare. Accessible, affordable childcare. And until we address that, we're going to have issues with productivity, with women not coming back to the workforce after having children, with having, you just have to look at the OECD figures where we have one of the highest rates of educated women in our population and a relatively low participation rate by women in our workforce. And it's the childcare, it's the accessibility of it, the affordability of it that goes on for years and years, not the 6 months of paid parental leave. That's actually the issue that needs to be discussed.
David, I see you nodding there. I mean, do you think the Abbott government has this one wrong? And is there a sense in business that is the case?
Well, I think good companies already do it. I think John's absolutely right. You've got to have the affordability test rather than impose something on companies who perhaps can't afford it. The key thing is, and I learned this first of all when I worked in America. Now, in America, if you had a child and came back to work, you had to come back in 4 weeks after having the child. That, to me, was not a civilised thing to do at all. So I'm delighted that companies in Australia are able to offer, in some cases up to 16 weeks, and you can take half pay and extend it. I think that's a civilised thing to do. And exactly as Carol mentioned, when you combine that with childcare and parental leave, it's all ultimately about making sure you can retain your top-class women, but all women in your workforce going all the way through.
Briefly, you're not saying the Abbott scheme is uncivilised, are you?
No, I'm not saying it's uncivilised. I'm just questioning is whether we shouldn't all be encouraged to do it and do it within our means. And it should be supported, but perhaps not the scheme, but the principle.
All right, we've got a few questions to get through. Elizabeth.
I think it's a question of what are we trying to solve for? And to get affordable, high-quality childcare, and not just for the first 5 years of children's lives, but after school, before school, etc., you need good quality childcare. And this just solves for well-paid women for about 6 months. And I don't think it's the right answer at all.
Do you think that, I mean, you obviously talk to a lot of people in business. Do you get the sense that is a widespread view?
Perhaps not that, but certainly the view that it might be a double whammy, that many companies already provide parental leave, and then they'll have to pay this as well.
Well, I presume that they won't have to pay this as well, or they'll save on their own schemes. I think it's important how this is implemented as to whether it does have a double whammy impact on businesses. I personally think it's a very enlightened policy, except it might have set the bar a little bit higher in terms of the upper level of income. This allows small business who otherwise might not want to employ women, who will then have maternity leave, to employ them and have that paid essentially by the taxpayers. If we hadn't have huge deficits, it would be a very enlightened policy to put in place. There may be other things we need to do to increase female participation, but I think this is a step in the right direction. It may just be ill-timed.
Let's stick with gender issues for a moment, and we'll go to our next question, which is from Rachel Bode.
Thanks, Tony. The Federal Workplace Gender Equality Agency recently released a study showing the gender pay gap in Australia is on average 17.5%, meaning women are on average paid 82.5 cents for every dollar of their male counterparts. The report also exposed the financial and insurance services sector as the sector with the second worst level of pay discrimination in Australia, with a pay gap of 31.4%, nearly double the national average. As a woman starting out my career in the finance sector, I'm alarmed by these statistics. I would like to hear from the panellists about what they think about the finance sector, or for that matter, any sector, justifying this gap.
Let's start with Carol.
Thanks, Rachel, for that question, because that is a really big issue. It's also a really complex issue. And when you talk to people or organisations as to how it comes about, there seems to be a whole host of reasons. One of the main reasons being that women leave to start a family, they come back, they're working part-time, they're actually, they're not put on the same pay level as their colleagues as when they left, and the ball starts rolling. Although sometimes even, it can start at the graduate level, I've been told, and it often happens with males being able to negotiate a little bit better than the females for their pay rates. I actually think that one of the ways to get around this is to actually, as an organisation, say we are going to publish our pay rates on a monthly basis. So everybody is going to know what everybody else is earning. It seems to me rather archaic that remuneration is a big secret within an organisation. I don't understand why that's the case.
Good luck with getting that through boards.
Well, actually, we do publish remuneration at certain levels on board. Yeah, remuneration on boards is published at the senior level. Now, when I talk to human resources people within organisations as to why this is happening, they all wring their hands and they say, "Oh, we don't know. It's a really difficult problem to attack." I don't think it is so difficult, because there are the exceptional organisations that really do these remuneration audits and make sure that there's absolute equity in pay rates, as there should be.
John Symond, the financial sector was mentioned there. Do you think it's particularly bad in the financial sector? And is it, as the questioner asked, discriminatory to have this huge gender pay gap?
Well, I'm all for equality, and the financial sector is one of the better paying sectors in the economy, and particularly for those that are off the most junior levels. It's been a big employer, and once you start climbing that ladder off the base, we've got to pay a lot of money to keep our people and to gain new people with skills. And, at times I say it's a ridiculously high paid industry. I talk to my business colleagues in non-financial businesses, and it's absolutely chalk and cheese. It can be, 30%, 40% higher in financial services, because, the banks are getting bigger and stronger, and they're employing from smaller, experienced organisations like ourselves, and our staff being plucked all the time because ours is a good training ground. So, the finance sector is generally a very good, high-paying sector.
But are the women getting paid as well in the
Yes,
finance sector?
we have absolutely no discrimination between male and female, and that's the way it ought to be.
That's great.
David Knox.
Yeah, Rachel, I think clearly the 17% pay gap is unacceptable. What we do in my company is we do look and we do check that there is gender equality on pay. But I actually like Carol's idea. You don't need to publish all the salaries, but you can publish basically whether you're equal on pay in gender equity. You can do that, and you can do it sort of in broad bands. And I think that would be that's a really good idea for us to do.
Thank you.
So I think we could be done.
And Tony, if I can just add, in our business, we've got 1,000 on the team. 40% of our managers are female.
Yeah.
40%.
And Tony, quite a few public companies already do this analysis across bands at senior level and all levels in the company, and actually publish it in their sustainability report.
Yeah.
So I chair of one company.
And well, we know that the Business Council is talking about 50% as being the number of senior women that should be working in companies. I mean, do you back that as well?
Absolutely. I think there's a great momentum now to fill the pipeline of women in executive and senior roles at every level in companies. And there's been a commitment made by the Business Council, it's the top 120 CEOs, that they will undertake a series of actions to try to move towards a 10-year target of getting equality in senior management levels. And I think it's a very bold aspiration, but there's also action plans to support it. So I think there's great momentum in this.
And Graham, to build on you, the way we're addressing the 50% target is when we bring in graduates for the last 5 years, we have said to ourselves they must be 50-50. They must be 50%, and that's for the last 5 years we've achieved 50%. Now, obviously, how they come through the system, we want to retain as many women as possible. But at least by starting at 50-50 over the last 5 years, we've got a good foundation.
Elizabeth, the pay equity issue was the first question. Of course, the issue of senior women in executive ranks is a critical one. Do the two things have a bearing on each other?
They do. I think the best thing about the debate, both here tonight and more broadly, is that now the men are talking about it. I mean, people like Carol and I and many others have been on this topic for many years, most of our careers. But to have men in the position, people on the panel and others, the male champions of change, I think is vital.
OK, let's move on. You're watching a special Business Leaders edition of Q&A. The next question comes from Stuart Lung.
Thank you, Tony. In my opinion, WorkChoices was an attempt to instill entrepreneurialism in the Australian workforce to improve productivity, as this is the only effective means for jobs to stay in Australia. So should we return to an employer-friendly industrial relations system?
Graham Bradley.
Well, look, I think there is a need to review many aspects of our industrial relations system. I don't think it encourages competitiveness, and I don't think, Stuart, it encourages the productivity. And frankly, it doesn't suit people's lives these days. We live in a 24/7 economy, a global economy. We no longer have 9 to 5, 5 days a week jobs, and yet our whole industrial system is in many ways geared around that old model, which doesn't suit all workers. And it doesn't suit a lot of employers who need to adapt their business. This is particularly true in areas like retail and food service and tourism and hospitality and so on. These are important industries where a lot of employment is created, where we do need to be competitive, and I think we do need to look at some aspects of our industrial relations system to bring them up to date.
Graham, the questioner suggested that WorkChoices was an attempt to instil entrepreneurialism into the Australian workforce. Now, according to the Coalition, WorkChoices, dead, buried, yes, staked through its heart. How are you going to encourage the Coalition government to go back to industrial relations reform, given that?
Well, Tony, I think many of us are just sick of some of this rhetoric around this issue. And what's in a name? What we've got to do is get back to the policies that really matter. And not be debating around the ideologies. Let's see what works for the community, what works for people, what works for employers, but also for employees. And let's make some sensible policies around it. And that's what I'll be saying to the Coalition government.
But do you have any particular policies in mind?
Look, I think there's a commitment to have a productivity review of the industrial relations system. I think there are quite a lot of amendments that were in the pipeline even before the election was called that ought to be progressed. But really, a fundamental look at this would be sensible. I don't think that's what the government has in mind, but at least getting the Productivity Commission to have a look at the issues will open up the debate.
Elizabeth.
I think it's a question of neither WorkChoices nor what we've had for the last 5 years or so. We're looking at, as a community, Graham's right, we need more flexibility. Employers do, but so do employees. And I think we've got the balance out of whack in the last few years, but also before that. How do we get back and have a conversation about what's fair as employers, because this is a big wealth creation part of the economy. But how do we ensure that the rules and regulations are fair for all the workers?
Once again, though, there does seem to be a disconnect between what the government, a new government, is prepared to do or is saying it's going to do and what the business community, at least represented here, actually wants.
Well, that whether we're representative or not may be a question, but certainly I think that we would be looking for more change than is currently underway.
David?
No, I think Stuart raised a very big word, which is productivity. And very often, I know the first thing we go to is wages and unions. And I think that's actually misplaced. I think there are many other levers that we can pull when we talk about productivity. I've mentioned one already, which is regulation. I think that would make a massive difference if we got that right. And obviously wages are important, but they're not the end of the story. And that's often where we go. We've got to genuinely work with the new government to drive productivity, because it's only by doing that that this country will become truly competitive. And there are lots of people around us who are really working hard at this, who are working very hard on all aspects of productivity. We need to do exactly the same if we can. I believe we can really compete, but we've got to do it.
But the key to work choices was not just wages, but wages and conditions and penalties. And you hear frequently from the business community, those conditions, those penalties are the things we want to see change.
Yeah. So this is a very narrow debate. I'm encouraging a much broader debate around productivity, because often we talk about this and we get bogged down in this as if this is the answer. It's not. It's a part of the answer. We've got to do far more. It's far broader.
David is absolutely right. And one of the big ways of increasing productivity, Stuart, is actually by increasing women's participation in the workforce. There have been a number of studies on this, one done by the Grattan Institute out of Melbourne, which is a fabulous study, which actually cites the improvement to GDP if we actually had more women in our workforce. And I think that by not focusing on participation as one of the levers, we're really missing out.
John Symond, the question was very specifically about whether the government, the new government, should go back to an employer-friendly industrial relations system.
Well, Tony, it hasn't worked efficiently for at least 15 years, and it again highlights having a complex, inefficient, expensive tax system. It shouldn't be us versus them, workers and employers. Both employees need to be incentivised to turn up and want to work, and incentivised to want to work overtime. You get low-income earners who will get less in some cases by working overtime. They get less per hour than the normal hours because they go into a higher tax bracket. Employers need to be incentivised to employ and abolish payroll taxes. And, you know, the tax system is broke. It's been broken for at least 15 years. We need a government with guts to overhaul the tax system so it's fair, much fairer for everybody.
Yep. OK, we've got to move on to let you have a small round of applause there. Let's move on to a very different issue. The next question comes from Cameron Rodwell.
Recently, there has been significant commentary regarding an eventual move from mining to agriculture as Australia's major growth sector. Considering the burgeoning need for agriculture to support an increasing global population, is a block of the GrainCorp sale to ADM only delaying the inevitable? What alternative options are available to GrainCorp for such a major capital injection?
Let's start with Graham Bradley.
Well, look, your question, Cameron, goes to a couple of fundamental issues. One is around are we welcoming of foreign investment in Australia? And I think we all agree that we'd like to grow our agricultural sector, that there is going to be a market for us in the burgeoning economies of Asia. And this is a great opportunity. We don't use all of our water, we don't use all of our land efficiently now. But we do need capital to invest in that. So my view is we need to bring in and welcome foreign investment. The issue around a particular company, GrainCorp, will go, I think, to a complex set of issues around national interest that the Treasurer will have to deal with if he is to approve that or reject that particular proposal. And it goes also to whether we have good competition regulation to ensure that when our farmers need to get access to markets and ports and facilities and infrastructure, that they can do so in a competitive environment that's well regulated and we can get good markets for our products. And so I don't think we should focus too much on the particular ownership of a particular piece of infrastructure if we've got good regulatory frameworks around it to encourage competition and ensure effectiveness. But we do need more capital in Australia to really fully realise our potential as a great food exporter.
Elizabeth, the National Party essentially worried that this an American company could take over this very core business and somehow, because there are American growers as well in the play on the other side of the Pacific, that could affect Australian growers. What are your thoughts?
Well, it would still be within this country. We need to make sure that the competition is right and the rules around that. But we shouldn't be afraid of foreign investment. Nestle, of course, is a foreign company, has been in Australia for over 100 years, creating employment, creating jobs. And I think we need a mature conversation about just what we need by way of capital, by way of innovation from overseas, coupled with our own innovation money and ideas. And it's not, for me, an either or. It is what's in our national interest, and we do have to have that debate. But if we do it in a way that looks and feels xenophobic, then we will be sending the wrong signals, not just to ADM and the GrainCorp issue, but more generally. And we do need the capital, and we do need that investment. And many of our big companies are, of course, from overseas.
Let's go to John Symond. What do you think is in the national interest in this case?
Well, Tony, I'm generally very acceptive of foreign investment. Australia has survived on foreign investment. However, I think this particular instance is going to need very, very, very close look at, because here we've got agriculture. Now, the world's talking about shortage of food and water going forward. We have sold so many of our iconic companies offshore. A lot of these companies who buy our iconic companies here don't even pay tax here. Here we've got, I think, a strategic asset owned by Australians, employing Australians and paying tax. I think we've got to be very careful here, because you have a look at what the government's been doing to prop up an ailing motor industry owned by foreigners, tipping in billions of dollars, and it's been on life support for years. Our farmers, zero subsidy, and a far bigger employer than the motor trade. So as pro I am for foreign investment, hey, my business wouldn't have got off the ground and created on the back of that a whole new industry, because we weren't a deposit taker. We didn't have the funds to lend out, and we relied on foreign investment, on borrowing. So I'm very pro foreign investment. However, I think in this particular instance, I think the government's going to have a look so closely, but for mine, I think they shouldn't be allowing it to go through.
Carol Schwartz.
Well, I actually agree with Elizabeth and Graham on this one. I think that foreign investment is absolutely crucial to our standards of living. We've been involved in foreign investment for decades. We want to be part of the global economy, and this is the way we do it. But you brought up the National Party on this, Tony, and I did read somewhere that Joe Hockey said he would not be bullied on this, and that a number of the National Party cabinet ministers are threatening to resign. Well, I think that will give us the opportunity then to put some good women on our cabinet.
But if the foreigners buy this company, the first thing they'll do is strip out a lot of the Australian workers. Their innovation will be what the innovation's needed for their country, not our country. So there's a high risk here.
David, what do you think about this debate?
Well, I think the key aspect of this debate, and I think we all agree foreign investment is absolutely critical. The key thing here is, when you consider a particular transaction, we're discussing GrainCorp right now, is you've got to make sure you've still got competition in Australia. And there's many ways you can do that. So I think the Treasurer has quite a few things that he can do. He can still approve it and then still do some things to make sure the ports are open, the railway lines are open, and you can get your grain in the silos. So I think that's possible. But the key thing for us, and the really important thing is, as business, and the thing that drives my business, is foreign investment. We just cannot underestimate the importance of foreign investment. As Elizabeth said earlier, there are 23 million Australians. We have a very vibrant financial markets, but it's just simply not big enough to support the level of investment required to unlock this economy. And You know, it is extraordinary the amount you require. In the gas game right now, we are investing $180 billion. There's no way that that could have been raised in Australia. It was raised, and it was raised by the support of foreign investment. So we mustn't be cautious in saying we welcome foreign investment while still making sure that we keep competition alive and well here.
OK, we've got to move on. We've got a video question. This one is from Leanne Murphy in Balcatta, Western Australia.
I'm a single parent, struggling to make ends meet, but really looking forward to the day that I might be able to once again own my own home. Property prices and rents continue to rise, forcing that dream even more out of my grasp. When I think about the tax break that is negative gearing, I'm astonished at the subsidisation of investing in property at the expense of low and middle income families. Do you think negative gearing should be abolished or at least quarantined, only available for new dwellings? And that thus giving low-income earners the opportunity to get into the property market?
Let's start with John Simon.
Well, first of all, we have an acute land shortage, particularly on the eastern seaboard. And I think this has been brought about by decades of inefficient government at federal, state, local level. The taxes today, you know, when I was a kid, you'd have a subdivision and the cost of services was included in the taxes we pay. Today, particularly in regional Australian capital cities, up to between $100,000 and $150,000 per block is levied by taxes onto the developer who slugs the first home buyer, and we wonder about the booming debt.
But John, I'm going to bring you up because that question was about a different tax relief that's being given to investors.
Absolutely. I come back to overhauling the tax system. Negative gearing wasn't designed for people who can afford to go and buy $1 million, $2 million, $3 million houses or apartments for negative gearing to offset the bulk of their interest payment off their tax. So negative gearing does need to be looked at in the tax system, because I don't think it's fair at the moment. I think it leans very heavily to the high income earners, and that needs to be brought into line, as is hundreds of other aspects of the tax system.
Let's hear brief answers from our panel on this. Carol.
Well, affordable housing is a huge issue globally. And however, negative gearing in this country, I believe, is an absolute political hot potato, and no government is going to touch it.
Yes, but should they?
I actually agree with John. I actually think that when we're looking at the whole tax mix, it definitely should be looked at.
John.
David, I
beg your pardon. Sorry.
I think, you know, Tony, you're absolutely right. The negative gearing is something which I wasn't familiar with until I came to Australia. It was a phenomenon I came across here. I've only recently discovered it exists, and it does seem to me as something that definitely needs to be looked at.
Elizabeth?
I think the latest figures are that in the September home sales, and John will know this better than I, but I think only 12% were first home buyers. The others were negative gearers or second and other home buyers. And that's a big problem, big social problem for us. And it wasn't intended to be used as it is. It is a hot potato, but it does have to be.
So there's a system in place that enables rich people to buy more property and to be subsidised by poorer taxpayers for doing it.
That's right.
This is the logic of this, isn't it?
That's the only logic.
Why is it impossible, apparently, for governments to touch this?
Well, I suspect...
Because they're foregoing billions in revenue.
Yes, they are. But I suspect there would be so many people who have got one, two or more properties that way.
Regular workers. That
the governments and oppositions make the decision that it's a vote loser.
It's an entrenched practice in Australia. I mean, it's just an expectation that everybody has.
But Leanne put a finger on the real issue here. If it were devoted to new property development, to new creation of new housing, it would actually go to relieve the shortage of housing. And I can really sympathise with Leanne, because Western Australia's got the worst affordability of housing and the least amount of rental and the highest rental growth in Australia.
I've got a question down the front there. I'll go quickly to you. Go ahead.
In the American system, they give tax relief to to any homeowners against the personal tax.
But you're taxed on when you sell the house, on the profit.
You're also taxed here when you sell it as an investor.
No, but you don't sell. You know, people have developed a strong asset base by creating value in their home, which also helps government support an ageing population. And you don't pay tax when you go to sell your own home.
All right, we're going to move along because it's a good comment. We'll take it on board, but we have to move on. We've got quite a few questions. You're watching the Business Leaders on Q&A. We've got 2 questions on the same subject. The first is a video from Edward Nankerville in Corindai, New South Wales.
Hi, my name's Ed Nankerville. My family and I farm on the Liverpool Plains in northern western New South Wales, the richest and most fertile food bowl in Australia. Our community survey showed that over 96% of the farmers have said no to coal seam gas. Your Santos representative told us that if you did not have a social licence to operate in the Liverpool Plains, that you would not proceed. Santos clearly doesn't have a social licence. Are you going to honour that promise and withdraw from the Liverpool Plains?
And we've got a follow-up question down here from Daniel Robbins, who I think has come all the way from Walgett to ask it.
David Knox. The increasing community opposition to coal seam gas extraction across Australia forced the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, to recently promise that no one should be forced to have a gas well on their property, and CSG should never be allowed in residential areas. Having recently lived and worked in northwest New South Wales, I met many residents asking the question, if CSG is a danger to residential areas, how are we to believe it is safe for your company, Santos, to extract gas near our water catchments, prime agricultural lands and rural homes?
David.
So first of all, thank you to Daniel and Edward for asking this very important question. I wanted just to start by saying coal seam gas in Australia and gas in Australia is a way of life. Here, 60% of homes in Eastern Australia use gas. And of that gas, 30% of that gas right now in the whole of Eastern Australia comes from coal seams, and if you live in Queensland, it's 90%. So coal seam gas is fully embedded. It's also a very sizable resource. It's a resource which I believe we can unlock, and we can use it to drive this economy forward very, very strongly. And that's obviously extremely important and we've been talking about the productivity agenda, if we're to drive productivity. Also has a lower carbon footprint than burning coal. It's not clean, I absolutely acknowledge that, but it's a much lower carbon footprint than burning coal. Now, to come to the specific question that I've been asked about, do we go onto landholders' properties without their permission? The answer to that is absolutely no, we do not. We always seek to have the permission of landholders. And I'll tell you why it's so important, Daniel, that we do that. Because we're not an industry that's going to be here for 5 minutes or even 5 years. We're going to be working in conjunction with the landowners and the communities for probably 20, 30, 40 years. So it's clearly not going to work if we're not welcome. And I can tell you that both in New South Wales around the Narrabri area, but in a larger scale in Queensland, broadly speaking, we are welcomed. We've signed lots of agreements, over 600 agreements in Queensland, over 50 agreements here in New South Wales for access to land where both parties are prepared to discuss, and we're able to go on and do our work. So we are well through this. We're well on.
So can I just confirm something then? Does that mean that if any farmer says to you, no, we don't want gas exploration or gas mining on our land, it won't happen?
That's right. Under this company I operate, if you don't want me on your land to drill a well, I will not be coming. I will work with farmers who do want me on the land. And I think it's very important that people are given that choice.
Daniel's got his hand back up.
Do you agree to meet with the farmer Tony Pickard, who lives, you've probably heard of Tony, he lives in the Pilliga area where you want to put 1,100 coal seam gas wells into his area. Now he lives there, very close to that area where you want to put wells, as close as, say, Debbie Orr up in Queensland, whose children have now got headaches, blood noses, irritation of the eyes and other health effects that are caused, according to our Prime Minister, possibly by coal seam gas. Will you meet with Tony Pickard and discuss those issues with him before you go into his area?
So obviously we won't be going to Tony Pickard or the Daniel Orr's area and without their approval. That's what I've said. We won't be going there at all. We do obviously meet a huge number of landowners because otherwise you can't negotiate access. You can't get a consensus deal that both sides are willing to go forward with. So absolutely.
So we've got another hand up right next to Daniel. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'd like to further add to that. The New South Wales government recently moved to protect families who live in zoned residential areas by introducing a 2-kilometre exclusion zone for coal seam gas activities. The exclusion zone for farmhouses, like where I live from Moree, is 200 metres, and from the home and 50 metres from our garden for coal seam gas activities, production and exploration. Do you think families living in rural areas should have the same protections and the right to have no mining near residential areas as well?
Yeah, I think absolutely. The issue here is obviously disturbance. If you're doing something within 200 metres of your home, there's clear disturbance. That's not something we would do as a company. We operate in the eastern Queensland, and we also operate around Narrabri. We basically do operate in the Pilliga forest, and that's broadly speaking areas where there's not large populations, and we do not operate close to people's homes. And I think it's really important that we establish this is a very important resource for Australia if we're to really build our competitiveness. If we're to supply energy for manufacturing, and 60% of manufacturing, 50% of manufacturing depends on gas, either as a feedstock or to drive the industry. Without gas, we'd be in a very different position than we are now.
Okay, I'm sorry.
We've got a great opportunity.
I'm sorry, guys. We're nearly out of time. We've got one last question that the whole panel can answer, and we're going to go to that. So we'll have to come back to that issue another time. That question comes from Molly Carr.
Oh, sorry. This is directed for everyone on the panel. How do you face the moral challenges of meeting shareholder demands and profit maximisation in the face of moral and social implications of certain business dealings in light of such instances as the British HSBC dealings with Iran, Sudan, Myanmar, Libya, and most significantly with Mexican and Colombian drug cartels? Also, the Nestle formula scandal in Africa. How do you balance your social conscience with your job and your own ambitions? Have any of you ever felt you've crossed the line? And if so, how have you dealt with it? And you have all crossed the line, so...
Well, that last bit was clearly a comment and an opinion, but Graham Bradley on the question.
Well, look, I don't feel I've crossed any line. I think that every company that operates in Australia, and all the ones that I'm associated with, the boards take a great deal of time to ensure that we've got socially responsible, environmentally responsible policies, that we publish those policies, that we update them, and that we enforce them and put them into action. And that we spend a fair bit of time with our management ensuring that they also have a culture of compliance and responsibility in the way we conduct our business. That's really all you can do at the board level. We're fortunate we live in a country that has strong environmental protection laws that are enforced by regulators and strong prudential laws as well that are enforced. So I think we don't suffer from some of the problems you've just outlined here in Australia.
Elizabeth.
Molly, I think we're all business people, but we're also citizens and consumers and all the other hats that are worn in this audience. And when we are making decisions around boardrooms, we're conscious of our responsibilities to shareholders, but we're also conscious that we need a small L licence to operate in Australia or in whichever countries that we also operate. And that's a balance that we attempt to achieve every day.
David.
Yeah, this is becoming an increasingly important issue, particularly as my industry comes closer and closer in contact with people who live and work on the land. And it's one we take incredibly seriously. And when we go offshore, it's even more so with things like facilitation payments, which we absolutely don't do. What you have to do.
You mean bribes?
Well, they're called facilitation payments, but effectively, you perhaps could use that term. But basically, frankly, to move one piece of paper from here to here. But you know, these things you've just got to not get involved and stay out of. And it is an incredibly important topic for business, and it's becoming even more so that we get this right. It's also important that we're held to account as well. So I welcome your question. It's really important that we are held to account so that we do perform to the very highest standards.
Carol.
I learnt a long time ago when I did a short course at Harvard University, Molly, from a wonderful lecturer called Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, who said that if you're not socially responsible and embedded in your society, in your nation, then you're actually not going to be a sustainable long-term company. Yeah, and that's absolutely the truth.
And John, to finish us off.
Yeah, look, I grew up in the back of fruit shops and, you know, I was taught by my mum and dad. I went 11 schools to university. My best education was my parents, who had very little education. They used to teach me as a young kid, looking after the shop. Give people what they want, treat people with dignity, and, you know, because we need them to come back. You do the wrong thing, you're not going to have a successful business. And as far as we're concerned, we got zero tolerance and, you know, for the wrong thing, and we try our hardest to just simply give people what they want.
Now, sadly, that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, John Symond, Carol Schwartz, David Knox, Elizabeth Proust, Graham Bradley. Thank you. Now, next Monday, Q&A will be live from India with an audience of Indian and Australian citizens. India sends more migrants to Australia than any other country. And with a rapidly growing economy and 1.2 billion people, it's on track to become an economic superpower. But what do Australians really know about India beyond curry, call centres and cricket? And what do Indians think about Australia after the student bashing controversy? Well, join us for Q&A India and a panel that includes India's Urbane Minister for Human Resource Development, Shashi Tharoor, Australian-born Bollywood star Pallavi Sharda, outspoken conservative commentator Shwapan Dasgupta, hard-hitting investigative journalist Shoman Chowdhury, and Australia's best-known India's best-known television interviewer Karan Tupper. Q&A India, that's going to be live from the Kingdom of Dreams Theatre south of Delhi. We'll see you from there.